So I found my vantage point to photograph a panorama here, and I'm ready to get my camera all set up. I'm using a tripod here, of course. I'm going to be capturing multiple frames, and it's very important that I have a stable platform to capture those frames, especially because I'll be panning across the horizon. So I want to make sure that everything lines up perfectly. I'm also using a ball head on top of my tripod. That's going to give me maximum flexibility in terms of being able to adjust the specific position of the camera so that I'm able to get it perfectly level through the full range of that panorama. Now, in many cases, you could use a bubble level attached to the top of your camera in the hot shoe for the flash. You can also use a bubble level attached otherwise to the camera or even just on your tripod head. In this case, though, I have a nice feature on my camera, and that is a level mechanism that is built in. And so I can adjust my camera, getting my ball head adjusted just right so that I can see that the bubble level, as it were, my level indicator, shows me with a green line that I am perfectly level. Now, it's not good enough to just be level in one position. I need to pan through my entire panorama and make sure that the camera remains level all the way through, or as close to being perfectly level all the way through as you possibly can achieve. And again, that can either be with a bubble level on top of the camera or using this feature on the back of the camera if your camera is so equipped. And it looks like I'm in great shape here as far as the camera being level through the full swing of my panorama. So we're all set in terms of the stable positioning of the camera. We can now think about the camera and the lens and settings there. Generally speaking, with a panorama, I always want to be shooting a focal length of about 50 millimeters or more, and in fact 100 millimeters or more is even better. And the reason for that is concerns about distortion. If you're shooting with a wide-angle lens, you're going to have much more distortion within the frame itself, and so from frame to frame, you're going to have a lot more work trying to get things to line up perfectly. So essentially, the longer focal length you can use when you're capturing the individual frames, the better results you'll have overall. So in this case, for my framing of this scene, I'm actually shooting at about 60 or so millimeters on my 24-105 lens, and that's giving me a good framing of the subject, a relatively tight composition for this scene. I could, if I wanted to, actually turn the camera vertical and potentially tighten things up a little bit more. That would call for creating more individual captures, which means greater resolution for the final result. But for this scene, I think I'm going to be just fine with a horizontal composition. I can then think about the individual camera settings. I'm going to capture at f8. That'll give me a nice sharpness. I don't need to worry too much about depth of field because I'm going to be focusing on relatively distant subject here. And because I'm on a tripod, a very stable platform, I actually can turn the ISO setting down to 100. I don't need to worry about a slow shutter speed. So in this case, taking a look at the scene, it looks like about f8 at 125th of a second will give me a good exposure. Now, as I'm setting my exposure though, I need to use a manual setting with the same exact aperture and shutter speed for every single frame so that we'll have a good match all the way across the panorama. So I'll swing through the full range of my panorama here to check the exposure. I'm set at f8, and it looks like for the majority of the scene here, 125th of a second is going to work out great. So I'm going to set my exposure mode to manual and adjust my aperture and shutter speed to f8 at 125th of a second. And just confirm one more time. Yep, that looks like it's going to work out just perfectly in terms of the exposure. It's very important that I use the same exposure settings, the exact same aperture and shutter speed all the way through the full range for every single capture in my panorama to ensure that they come together as seamlessly as possible in terms of overall tonality. Now, I'm capturing in RAW mode, and so actually my white balance setting, my color temperature adjustment in the camera is a complete non-issue. I can apply the adjustment for the color temperature after the fact in post-processing. However, to make that process a little bit easier, to help things come together a little bit more easily, I'm going to set a custom white balance, a white balance preset. So rather than working in auto white balance, I'm going to, in this case, set it to cloudy. This is a cloudy sky condition today, of course, and that's going to help warm up the scene just a little bit in any event. But again, it's not important since I'm capturing in RAW. This is purely to ensure consistency of color across each of the frames in my panorama. So I'm all set here. I've got my camera positioned on a stable tripod. Everything is nice and level through the full range of the panorama, and I've got my exposure setting, my white balance setting. Everything is good to go, so I'm ready to capture the individual frames of my panorama. All right, I've got everything set up just the way I'd like it for my panorama. I'm ready to capture the individual frames to produce the final image. Now, I do want to go through the image one more time. I'm just going to swing through this panorama because up until now, I've been so focused on the individual settings for the camera that I might have focused a little too much on those and not looked at the overall scene quite well enough. So I just want to swing through one more time, this time paying careful attention to the composition. What's in the foreground? What's in the background? Does the horizon stay level throughout the entire range here? And I'm also going to think about where I'm going to start and end this panorama. Generally speaking, I want to have some framing elements. I want to have something over on the left that bounds the overall composition and something on the right. I want an entrance and an exit, you might say. In this case, I have some trees in the foreground, and that'll serve as a nice framing on the left side of the panorama. And I also have a tree over on the right side. In this case, just to give myself a little more flexibility, I think I'm going to shoot right past that tree to give me a little bit more landscape to work with. So I'll go ahead and get set up here for my first frame, and I will click and take that picture, and I've got my first frame. Now I need to figure out where I'm going to set my second frame, and for that I need to think about the overlap of the individual frames. Generally speaking, if I'm shooting at a relatively long focal length, say 50 millimeters or above, about a 25% overlap is going to be more than adequate. Less than 50 millimeters, I might go closer to a 50% as that overlap. One of the easy ways to accomplish that is to look through the frame and pick an object in the scene that's about a quarter of the way in from the right-hand side of the frame. Then I'm going to make that quarter of the way in point become the left edge of the frame when I turn the camera. So I'll go look for an object here. I've got a nice house off in the distance that I can use as a reference. It's about a quarter of the way in from the right side of the frame, so I'll simply pan the camera so that that house is now at the left edge of the frame, and now I know that I have a good 25% overlap. I'll do the exact same thing once again and continue that exact same process, moving through my panorama and capturing each individual frame, again with about a 25% overlap until I reach the end of my panoramic scene here. And that's all there is to it. Obviously, quite a bit of setup is involved in getting everything ready, getting the camera level, getting the settings just right for the entire range of the panorama, but then it's simply a matter of panning through and capturing those individual frames, and then of course we can bring those frames together in the digital darkroom to produce our final result.